with a really bizarre point of view.
The last thing that I'll say about this is that there's because I want to get your take. There was a journal. I can't remember what journal it was from, but somebody did a study, and they said that there was a correlation between religion in today's society declining and the rise and increase in pseudoscience, things like beliefs like this, like the flat Earth, anti-vax, so that there's a correlation as people's religiosity goes down, their need to want to find something to replace that. Do you think that's dealing with evolution? Do you think that's an evolution thing that has just kind of went with us, that need to want to think that there's something else out there? Is that rooted like deep within us as a species?
You could talk to a lot of psychologists and anthropologists argue that if you look across human cultures, there always seems to be a need for mysterious things and for greater mysteries and unexplained things, that we seem to want that no matter how much science explains the world to us. We still want something that science doesn't explain. And there is some element of that, as you say, that certainly 150 years ago or 100 years ago even, the culture was very strongly religious. But you notice as for example, when I wrote a book about UFOs and aliens, the real explosion of UFOs and aliens begins around the beginning of the 20th century, about the same time science fiction and science fantasy takes off, and gradually begins to replace a lot of other things. And the most obvious way it does, that you never see any reports of UFOs or aliens in the 19th century. It all happens at the very end of the 19th century or the 20th century or later, as the culture shifts to the science fiction literature. It creates this meme they all glom onto. And if you saw something in the sky, say in 1850 or earlier, you wouldn't call it a UFO, you'd call it an angel. And so, a lot of these things people see that they don't understand in the sky, they're very quickly explained by whatever the prevailing cultural meme was, which was right up until the early part of the 20th century, was always a religious icon of some kind. And then when religion started to fade and science fiction took a lot of the mystery on itself, now everything people see they don't understand the sky is UFO. And so that's very strongly tells me that UFOs and angels both are cultural phenomena, not real things.
and you also noted that there was a distinct correlation between evolution deniers and climate change as well.
Yeah, that comes from a different perspective, and that is that once you get into one of these camps that buys very strongly into a particular set of viewpoints, and so, for example, the fundamentalist groups have all locked in very hard on denying evolution, anything else that threatens their purview, and climate change does, because it doesn't give them, a view of the earth that's favorable the way they think about it, that therefore also has to be a great lie of Satan. And so they often combine the two things. And of course, it's very hard to tease that away from the fact they're all tied into the political bubble as well, the Fox News, liosphere or whatever. You get this continuous right-wing bubble where these people only hear media that Fox News promotes and don't hear the other side of the story ever. And so there's very little for them to ever doubt. So once I don't think they have a strong personal opinion about climate change, but what they do find themselves doing is because their flock agrees with this idea that climate change is a hoax, therefore they all follow like sheep. And so there really isn't any thought given to it. They just do whatever the leader of the group tells them to do.
Living in Canada's Texas, it seems to me like it also corresponds that the most religious states and provinces are also the oil-producing ones. And there seems to be some happy accidents there.
That's more likely accident. It just happens that the great petroleum basins of the U.S. are in these big open rural states, Texas and the Rocky Mountains primarily, and Alaska, of course. And the big open rural states also tend now to have gravitated to one extreme of our political perspective, because almost all the rural population now is very much uniformly Republican, and the rest of the population has moved to big cities and become Democrat. That's the greatest polarization we have right now in politics in this country, rural versus urban.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Okay, so Paul, I'm going to hand it over to you now, and we'll go into the direction of some science stuff.
So thank you so much for being here, and I love the opportunity to talk to you. As we mentioned briefly before the show, I was very recently a young Earth creationist, which you briefly mentioned. So I remember being in that camp. But it also means I'm on this great catch up in my adult life of having to, get to where I should have been all along. So apologies if some of these things are basic, though I think maybe some of the audience along with me maybe doesn't know all this. One of the things I was really
I
talking
always
about
say
was,
most Americans generally don't know this stuff. It's not just the religious ones. The average high school student doesn't learn much either.
So if you don't mind starting, I'd love to start with birds. Obviously, I think a lot of people, my first discovery that birds might be related to dinosaurs was throwaway lines in Jurassic Park. I wonder if you could just, before I have some of the specific questions, could you lay out kind of the case? What's the best evidence? What makes a scientist think that a T-Rex and a chicken are related? Like, what's the basic evidence there that would point to that conclusion?
It comes from a tremendous amount of anatomy that you find in these very, very primitive birds, Archaeopteryx being one now of hundreds of different that have been found. And the most closely related dinosaurs, things like what's called Velociraptor in the movies, even though it's really Deinonychus, they have a extreme high number of anatomical similarities, not just in the bones, which we have preserved pretty well, but quite a few of these specimens, especially those that are preserved from the Lower Cretaceous Liaoning province of China, have everything else preserved. They have the feathers, they have the stomach contents, they often have even things like color pigments preserved on them, so we actually know what color their feathers were. And so we have a whole slew, not just of early birds that are very dinosaur-like, but quite a few dinosaurs that are very bird-like, but no one ever called them a bird. And it's becoming more and more clear that just about the entire Dinosauria, almost all the dinosaurs, at least the smaller ones, had feathers. It's a universal feature now found in dinosaurs. And there was just a report last week claiming that the fibers that are found in the bodies of pterosaurs, which are not dinosaurs but are related to them, are probably feathers as well. So it may turn out feathers go all the way back to the branch that separates pterodactyls from dinosaurs. In either case, feathers are a universal dinosaurian feature, and it's only the larger body ones probably that lost feathers, but they might have had them as juveniles when they were smaller bodied. So feathers is just one piece of the puzzle. For example, if you look at the wrist of a bird, it can only move in a plane, up and down motion, a grabbing motion, forward and down. That's the way it's supposed to work, although in the movies Deinonychus has its hands moving like this, which is not possible. Dinosaurs only held their hands like this. That motion is a grabbing motion for an animal like Velociraptor or Deinonychus. It's also the same motion as their wrist snaps that you find in the downstroke of a bird. And it's because they have a unique bone right here in their wrist. It's shaped like a half moon. It's a fusion of a bunch of the bones of the wrist into one half moon shaped thing that gives that wrist that ankle, that joint that flexes like that. Another thing you find that's dinosaurian all the way to the core, next time you have your Christmas or Thanksgiving turkey, or go to get a bucket of chicken legs from the Colonel or wherever, when you take out the drumstick, you'll always notice at the very bottom of the drumstick where you hold on to it and there's no meat to be eaten, there's a little cap of cartilage there. And if you look at an adult bird, they have that as well. Well, usually it fuses to the end of that bone, which is the same as your shin bone. And that cap of cartilage is a unique joint that's found only in dinosaurs and pterodactyls. It's called the mesotarsal joint. And so dinosaurs and pterodactyls have the ankle hinges not between the ankle bones themselves, but between the first row of ankle bones and the second row of ankle bones. The first row of ankle bones is fused to the back and bottom of the shin bone and does not move anymore. And so then they have a hinge in their ankle that's unique, and only birds, dinosaurs, and pterosaurs have that unique feature. A whole slew of other unique anatomical characteristics. Next time you have a carcass, like I did at Christmas time, a carcass of a turkey in front of you, you can find about 7 or 8 dinosaurian features just there in the bones of a turkey. And so it's very, very, it was apparent back in the 1860s when the first Archaeopteryx was found, and people like Thomas Henry Huxley pointed out it's extremely dinosaur-like. But it's only just gotten to be stronger and stronger case in the last 50 years or so, ever since they found things like Deinonychus and Velociraptor.
So I know you mentioned Archaeopteryx. I would have probably just said, well, Archaeopteryx is just a bird. And I've also, of course, heard people say, well, it's just a lizard. What about Archaeopteryx tells us that it was both things?
Well, because it has a lot of dinosaurian features you will never find in any living bird. So that stretches most people's definitions of birds beyond the breaking point. Archaeopteryx, for example, as I mentioned, has a dinosaurian wrist, a dinosaurian ankle, which, of course, all birds have, but it's not found outside of certain groups of dinosaurs. It's beyond birds. And it also has things like, for example, the tail is composed of a whole string of bones, like a dinosaur's tail, even though it had feathers on top of it, which no bird today has. All living birds have got all their tailbone fused into that little tiny thing in the back of their pelvis called the parson's nose in common terms, or the urostyle and uropatagium in former terms. And that's unique to birds, but it comes from a tail like a dinosaur's tail, which had a whole string of bones down the end. If you look at the fossil of Archaeopteryx and a lot of the primitive birds we find from the Cretaceous as well, they still have all their fingers, okay? And a modern bird's hand has no fingers anymore, right? It's just that little fused triangle of bone that you find on the end of your chicken wings that you normally don't eat because there's no meat on it. That fused up hand bone is where all their wing feathers attach. And so they don't use fingers anymore to fly. They use a support for a whole bunch of wing feather shafts. And then, of course, Archaeopteryx has teeth like a dinosaur. No bird alive has teeth. But birds do have the genes for teeth because you can mess around with the embryology of a chick and make a bird have teeth again, but they won't be teeth of the animal you messed around with. They'll be teeth of dinosaurs. So it's incredible how much dinosauria there is in birds and vice versa.
So this actually I don't know the answer to. So when you do that, and they call that, of course, an atavism, I believe, is what the kind of the
atavism, evolutionary throwback.
Are they, when you do that to a chicken, is it actual teeth or is it more of a serration of the beak?
No, it's actual teeth. These things have teeth, and as embryos they do, and then they presumably would have lost them if they had ever grown up. These chicks, of course, don't grow up; they die, and then they're sacrificed to analyze their tissues. But there are ways you can mess. They've also messed around with the genes and gotten a dinosaurian snout instead of a beak. So they now have done that as well with birds. They've also done other things as well, like mess around with the genes and gotten a long bony tail on a chicken. Now, it didn't grow up to adulthood, but they were able to change the genetic controls on their features so that they were able to recover dinosaurian features, teeth, a beak, or a snout instead of a beak, and the tail. All those things can be done by just messing around with the genes of baby chicks.
Can I ask a question real quick, Paul? To kind of tail end on that. Is there any way to tell like what the colors or patterns that these dinosaur feathers had? Is there any way to tell like what it may have looked like?
Yeah, there's a few examples now known. Again, these are mostly from these extraordinary specimens from the Cretaceous of China that are preserved in these sort of these lakes that had no oxygen at the bottom when they died and were buried. And so they have not only all the feathers well preserved, but in many specimens they have what are called melanosomes, which are these little pigments that are found inside the feather shafts. And they are preserved as they were when they were animals alive. So we can see some idea, especially the black and white contrasts, and in some cases we can see reds and some as well. So there, if you look online, you'll see pictures of a number of these very primitive dinosaur bird transitional fossils that have been reliably reconstructed as to what color they were. Their feathers, it had, for example, one of them had stripes on its tail that went black and white all the way down, and others have combinations of black and other things on their feathers. That's the only place where we know that for sure. Most dinosaurs, when you see them reconstructed, first of all, they're reconstructed without feathers, which is false. But even if they're reconstructed with feathers, for most dinosaur specimens, we don't have any actual evidence of what color they were. That's just artist's imagination. So 90% of the time, what you're looking at is an artist's guess of what color dinosaurs were, and we're really not sure. But those really, a few examples, we do now actually have direct evidence.
Sweet. Okay, Paul.
So I was going to ask real quick:
go ahead.
If these chicks have these atavisms for teeth, would it be indicative that that is the only possible way that they have the ability to grow teeth is some kind of lineage via evolution, cladistically? So when a young Earth creationist says, "Well, it's just a design, a similar design," how do you usually address that? Because in order to be a similar design, it would seem like every species on the planet would have the exact same abilities to do certain things.
No, it's not. They're very specifically, very specifically dinosaurian shaped teeth. And not only that, but the way they did this, in order to get these teeth to regrow, was they took a baby chick and then they implanted the epithelium of the